wash operations director, Mark North, and
Public
promotions
relations.
expert, public relations. What's her face? Met with tour officials late into the evening to settle or talk about, possible liability. I don't know.
So.
I haven't already pushed to come down front, but could be persuaded to do so. We'd love to have a few more of you down here. I think it'll make our presentation all that much more effective, and you'll get a lot more out of it. So please feel free to come on down. My name is Corwin Ritchie. I'm president of the Iowa County Attorneys Association. I would like to welcome all of our guests tonight. This program is the kickoff to our Iowa County Attorney Fall Conference here in Ames at the Gateway Center. We're pleased that we have with us faculty and staff and students from Iowa State, as well as I am certain members of the Story County Bar Association and other members of the public who are interested in this particular issue. We welcome you. This is a bit different opening for county attorneys. Normally we're not involved in a public event of this nature, but we're glad to have you with us tonight. To start off tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Richards, the Story County Attorney, a friend and colleague, well respected by prosecutors across the state of Iowa, to welcome you and say a few words. Mary.
Goodness sakes. This is called operating from the seat of your pants or something. Somebody told me, we'll ask you to say a few words of welcome, but I guess I just completely spaced off when the few words of welcome were going to come. At any rate, we are delighted that everybody can be here. The county attorneys who have been in Ames before for a conference about 4 or 5 years ago, I believe, are at least familiar with the Gateway Center, but this is the first time that you've had a chance to really enjoy the Iowa State Center facilities. I think that you will really enjoy the rest of the community during the week that you're here. There is a marvelous lineup of speakers and ideas and information for you all. And those of us from this community are very happy to have you here. Thanks.
She was on the program, and we appreciate that, Mary. Thank you. For those, can you hear me? Good. For those of you who are lawyers in our audience, you'll be happy to know that this program does qualify for 2 hours of continuing legal education. And so whether you're registered at our conference or not, you can take advantage of those hours. I would like to thank the sponsors of this event. There are a number of them who've come together to sponsor this particular program. Obviously, the Iowa County Attorneys Association, Prosecuting Attorneys Council, the ISU Committee on Lectures, the Joseph Story Association, which I understand is the Iowa State Student Pre-Law Society, and last but not least, the Story County Bar Association. To all of those groups, we thank you very much for your input, help, and financial support. The topic tonight, of course, you know why you're here. Prohibition versus legalization, our drug policy considered. This is a hot topic around the nation now, and I think what you will hear tonight will give you pause to consider your individual position and to determine your own position on this topic. I hope that everybody, when you came in, got a handout of articles. Anybody that didn't, they're available back by the door, and we don't expect you to have read those by the time the program starts, But you will note that there is one article on the cover by Ethan Nadelman, one of our presenters, followed by an article by Robert Peterson, our other presenter tonight. And at the rear is an article entitled Drug Policy, Striking the Right Balance by Avram Goldstein and Harold Calant. It is to this third article, which you might refer to as a middle approach or a middle position, that we have asked our two presenters tonight to direct their attention. And so while you maybe haven't read it now, if you do so after the program, you will see that their remarks are directed somewhat to that particular article. Is that me? Okay. Our procedure or format will be Mr. Nadelman will lead off. He will take what time he feels is necessary to present his position on the legalization issue, followed by Mr. Peterson. And then each of the presenters will have time for a brief response. We hope to keep that to 5 or 6, 7 minutes or so. And then following that, we will open it up to questions from the audience. And at that time, we will remind you that if you have a question, step to either aisle, and there's a mic already erected over here, and we will have a portable mic in this other aisle, and we will direct you to the mic to ask your question of either of these gentlemen. Ethan Nadelman is a professor of public and international affairs at Princeton University. His articles, congressional testimony, and television appearances have stimulated much of the recent public debate on the legalization of drugs. He received his doctorate in political science and law degree from Harvard. Robert Peterson served on special assignment to the U.S. Department of Justice while Assistant District Attorney in Buffalo, New York. As Deputy Pennsylvania Attorney General, he served as Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Drug Initiative. He was counsel for the National Association of Attorneys General and is now working as a drug policy consultant, and informs me that he is writing a book on drug culture and living in New York at the present time. I'll ask to take the podium and address you now, Mr. Ethan Nadelman, to be followed by Robert Peterson. Please give them welcome.
Can you hear me? Is this thing on? And can you hear me in the back of the room? Yeah? Okay, because since this podium is sort of off to the far side, I feel a little more comfortable standing here. First, I want to thank Corey Ritchie and the Iowa prosecutors and Iowa State University for setting this up and for inviting me. I must admit I was a little surprised to receive an invitation to Iowa. I'm used to going to Florida or New York or Chicago or Detroit, or the places with big drug problems. And I was a little surprised with Iowa, although I guess every place around the country has to worry about the drug issue and about the drug problem. I'm just curious, if I could just get a show of hands. I understand the audience is a mixture of prosecutors and their spouses and family on the one hand, and students on the other. Can I just ask all the non-prosecutors and spouses to raise their hand, just so I have an idea? So it's about half and half. Okay, well, I'll try to address my comments to both of you. The argument's essentially the same, but I know that prosecutors often have special concerns and special perspectives. What I'm going to talk about today is called drug legalization, and I should begin by saying that I hate that word. Legalization makes it sound like I'm saying that drugs are good, that drug abuse is good, that everybody should go out and get high, and that's not at all what I'm saying, not whatsoever. I mean, when people talk about legalizing political parties in Eastern Europe, that's a wonderful thing. Legalizing drugs is not a wonderful thing, right? I mean, basically, in many ways, it's not such a good thing, in fact. But it may very well be the best of a lot of crummy options for dealing with what is a very tough problem. Now, ask the question then, what does this legalization mean? I'd like to use the word decriminalization or harm reduction policies, what they call it in England, or normalization, or I wish there was a verb for public healthization policies, but unfortunately there isn't. But what does it generally mean? Let's use that term as a shorthand and explain it. Obviously, for some people, legalization just means simply taking the crime out of the drug business. And we know that depending upon how far you did legalize drugs, it would largely take the crime out of the drug business, just like the repeal of prohibition took some large part of the crime out of the alcohol business. For some people, it means take the money out of the drug business. And once again, depending upon how you run it, you could take out much of the money, profits that amount to anywhere from 20 or 50 or 100 or 150 billion dollars. Nobody really knows for sure. For some people, it's a rallying cry. In very much the same way that repeal prohibition was 60 years ago. And just as the repeal movement 60 years ago brought together people from across the political spectrum and with all different sorts of careers and perspectives and alcohol problems and from different places of the country and with very different notions about what prohibition should be replaced with, well, it's the same thing today. Legalization, opposition to drug prohibition, gets support from across the political spectrum. It's oftentimes, there are jokes made about whether I'm on the right side of the podium and my debater's on the left or vice versa. And in fact, this is not one of those issues. It's quite interesting that when I debate this issue, sometimes my allies, either in person or in spirit, are people like William Buckley or Milton Friedman, the conservative Nobel Prize-winning economist, or Gary Becker, the guy who many people think will win the Nobel Prize, or George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, or The Economist magazine in England, or half the conservative economic newspapers in Europe. And on the other hand, it might be Ira Glasser of the American Civil Liberties Union, or the membership of the Americans for Democratic Action, the ADA, but not, mind you, their president, Charlie Rangel, the Harlem congressman. And in between, there'll be people like Kurt Schmoke, the very brave and intelligent mayor of Baltimore, also the former chief prosecutor of Baltimore, and Carrie Saxon Perry, also the mayor of Hartford, Connecticut. In fact, almost all the politicians who have come out this way have been black, interestingly enough. George Crockett, the congressman from Detroit, the only member of Congress to actually say publicly that he was in favor of legalization. And you have state senators in New York and in Philadelphia and in Missouri also expressing themselves. Interestingly, the only Republican politician that I know of who's come out in favor is Bill Mathesius, who lives where I live in Mercer County, New Jersey, a staunch Republican, somebody who was considered to be a candidate for the attorney generalship of the state if Jim Carter had won the gubernatorial election there. And he, a strong, also former FBI agent and former prosecutor, very tough on crime. And he too is now speaking around the country about legalization, trying to persuade people who have more backgrounds like his than mine that this is the way to go. Now, it's interesting, by the way, these names that you see publicly associated, they're really just the tip of the iceberg. A few judges, congressmen, legislators, prominent officials, businessmen, what have you. It's really just the tip of an iceberg, of a very large iceberg. And I can reassure you that my files are full of letters from prominent political officials, ex-mayors, former U.S. attorneys, DAs, cops, corrections officials, drug treatment people, teachers, lawyers, grandparents, kids, what have you. Not kids, actually. Saying, I'm with you. I'm with you. The kids say, I'm with you, but they don't say the second part. The second part is, when I say, that's wonderful, I'm very pleased to know that. Can I use your name the next time I speak? And the judge or the former U.S. attorney or whoever says, no, I'd prefer you didn't do that. And I say, well, why not? And he says, come on. I still want that promotion to the appeals court. Come on, I'm still thinking of running politically. Come on, as George Shultz put it, I hate having my friends and other people walk away from me at cocktail parties. Right? But I'm waiting for guys like you and Schmoke and the others to make it respectable for me to, so to speak, come out of the closet and express myself on it. Now, legalization also has a few other meanings. One of those, and in fact, probably the principal meaning, if you really look at what's been written about the issue, this is really what it is. What legalization essentially is a critique of drug prohibition. It's a model. It's a model for analyzing, does drug policy work? And for trying to determine the criteria about which we say whether or not it works. A synonym might be a cost-benefit analysis. What legalization essentially says is, let's look at current drug prohibition policies. Let's ask, what are their costs and what are their benefits? Let's look at other drug prohibition policies and ask what are their costs and what are their benefits. And let's look at the great variety of what are called drug legalization policies, and let's ask what are their costs and their benefits, and let's agree as best we can about which policy achieves the best mix of costs and benefits. Right? Let's strike the right balance, as the article in the packet of readings said, although I disagree with the way that they balance them. Because let's remember, it's not prohibition A or legalization B, pick your choice. In fact, prohibition to legalization is a wide continuum of policies. At one end, you have the policies we associate with Malaysia and Iran and Singapore and communist bloc countries, all the places that we think the United States should not be like. And at the other extreme, you have the far libertarian legalization scenario, which is something like what the United States was in the 1880s and 1890s and turn of the century, when there were very few drug laws. And in between, there's a whole spectrum of policy. And the objective should be to pick the best mix. And what should the objectives of drug policy be? Excuse me for talking so quickly, it's because I grew up in New York and I have a lot to say, but please stick with me. What should the objectives of drug policy be? Should it be to make a drug-free society, no matter what the cost? I don't think so. A democratic society should not be involved in a crusade, not something where it doesn't care what cost it has to pay in terms of either dollars or human lives. That shouldn't be it. Plus the fact that there's never been, so far as we know, a drug-free society in human history. Some people say the Eskimos were a drug-free society because they couldn't grow anything. Right? They probably got high on smoked whale fat, something like this. But so far as we know, there's never been a drug-free society. I doubt that very many people in this audience could really call themselves drug-free. Maybe illegally drug-free, but not legal drug-free. So what should the best drug policy be? Well, it seems to me it really amounts to two things. On the one hand, let's minimize the total extent and cost of drug abuse. And notice I don't preface that by saying illegal drug abuse, because I think alcohol abuse and tobacco abuse are really our two most serious problems on the broad level of society. And notice I don't say drug use, because quite frankly, I don't think moderate use of alcohol or tobacco, or for that matter, marijuana, cocaine, hallucinogens, or what have you, is bad. To me, the determinant is, are you abusing those drugs? And what does abuse mean? It means do you harm yourself? Do you cause harm to yourself? And do you take those drugs in such a way that they cause you to hurt other people as well, whether it's your fetus, your children, or other people out in the community? But there's a second half of the drug policy objective. And the second half is to reduce the costs, the negative consequences of drug prohibition policies. And I'm going to explain a lot more what I mean by that as I continue. Now, finally, legalization is also another way of saying, let's stop treating the drug problem primarily as a criminal justice problem, and let's treat it instead primarily as a public health issue, primarily as a policy in which we rely on public health mechanisms and which we have some greater trust than we do have now in the capacity of individual adult Americans to make sensible choices about their own lives and even occasionally the freedom to make the wrong choices. Mayor Schmoke put it well. He said, if we're going to have a war against drugs, it shouldn't be headed by the Attorney General. It should be headed by the Surgeon General. And to some very good extent, that is what I'm talking about. Okay, so let me just reassure you. Legalization doesn't mean legalizing drugs tomorrow. It doesn't mean making crack cocaine available in 7-Elevens to be sold, open 24 hours a day and sold in vending machines and made available as cigarettes. What an absurd policy we have with cigarettes. It doesn't mean that. It means step-by-step evolutionary policy, finding a way to reduce drug abuse and reducing the cost of drug prohibition. It also means, by the way, just as there are splits among drug prohibitionists, there are splits among drug legalizers. There are the libertarians who just as soon eliminate virtually all laws, except maybe restrictions on sales to children. But what's interesting is that most of the people associated with what's called legalization favor getting tougher on alcohol and especially tobacco, and at the same time being tough on marijuana, cocaine, and heroin, but pushing the criminal justice system to the edges of the policy, not front and center. And they also tend to mean something else. They don't mean throwing up your hands. What it means is taking the resources which are pouring by the billions and tens of billions into enforcement and spending them someplace else that's a lot more beneficial and a lot more humane. And here I'm talking about drug treatment programs. They're no panacea. Most people even drop out of them. But we do know they make some difference. And we do know they reduce the likelihood that drug addicts will go out and commit crimes and hurt other people. But even more importantly, drug abuse prevention. And here I'm not talking about those K through 12 drug education programs that you hear so much about. They do some good, and Just Say No does some good. They also backfire sometimes. Sometimes they make people more curious instead of the other way around. Much more important are the sort of non-drug specific drug prevention programs. Things like Head Start programs in the inner cities, pre and postnatal care, job training programs, all the things that are not just a decent and humane thing to do, but also dollar for dollar, more cost beneficial, more likely to produce non-drug abusing, tax-paying, productive citizens in the future than all this money going towards jails and prisons and courthouses and what have you. Okay. Now, ask the question, why? Why should we even bother talking about legalization? And it seems to me that's an easier question to ask, maybe in a place like Iowa, which seems to me doesn't have a very serious drug abuse problem, as opposed to the inner cities that we have in New Jersey and New York and throughout much of the rest of the country. But let's ask, why should we even talk about it? There's really three reasons. And these three reasons will provide the sort of structure for the remainder of this talk. The first reason is that everything we've been doing in the past, that people are doing now, and that people are talking about doing in the future, in terms of criminal justice approaches to the drug problem, is largely doomed to failure. And it has nothing to do with corruption in third world countries, and nothing to do with turf squabbles between law enforcement agencies, and nothing to do with whether or not we have a drug czar, or whether or not his name is William Bennett, which I understand won't be in another week or two. Right? What it has to do with is the nature of the market, the nature of the commodity, and how lucrative the whole thing is. Okay? To some very good extent, I would claim that the successes we've seen in the 1980s in reducing drug abuse have very little to do with drug enforcement and much more to do with many other government policies and trends in society. And many of the worst aspects of what's happened over the last decade have a lot to do with law enforcement, which brings me to the second part of the argument, which is that it's that most of what people commonly identify as part and parcel of the drug problem are, in fact, the results of drug prohibition. In just the same way that 60 years ago, when people looked at the alcohol problems in this country, most of what they identified were the results of alcohol prohibition. Sure, people looked at alcohol abuse and drunkenness and all these other sorts of things. And that was one of the reasons they imposed alcohol prohibition in the first place. But by the end of the 20s and the early 30s, they were looking at other things. They were looking at Al Capone and organized crime and rising levels of violence and corruption, overflowing prison cells and courthouses, and corruption among police agencies, and tens of millions of Americans violating the law and having less respect for the legal system and the political system, and kids growing up with bootleggers as their role models, and even tens of thousands of Americans being blinded and poisoned and killed by bootleg liquor, bad bootleg liquor, liquor that was more dangerous because it was illegal. And Americans looked at that, and they made the distinction between alcohol abuse and the results of alcohol prohibition, and they made a very interesting decision, one that's only happened once in American history. They repealed the National Amendment. I'm suggesting that it's much the same thing today. Now, of course, not as many people use drugs as drink alcohol, and even if all the drugs were legal, that would still be the case, because alcohol is special in American society. But it's still the same. We do have a problem of illegal drug abuse in the society, among kids, among older people, what have you. There's no question about it. And it needs direct, humane approaches to deal with it, and to deter people from getting involved in drug abuse. But look at everything else. Look at the organized crime and the violence and the corruption. And look what's happening in the inner cities, and look what's happening in Latin America. And look at people dying of overdoses and spreading AIDS and all these other sorts of things, and the violence you see in the inner cities and the shoot-ups and all this sort of thing, and billions of dollars going down the drain. And all of those things, that's not just the drug problem. Those things are the results of drug prohibition. And what legalization says is not eliminate all of them, legalize everything. You'll never abolish the black market. Let's face it, tobacco and alcohol are largely legal. There are still small black markets in those things. It means let's start to reduce those costs. Let's think of a balanced, sensible policy that de-emphasizes criminal justice. And lastly, the third reason is that maybe, just maybe, we have a lot less to fear from moving in that direction, from moving away from our reliance on the criminal justice system. When I debate this issue sometimes with politicians, Senator D'Amato from New York, for example, and they'll say, Professor Nadelman, he wants to turn our nation into a nation of zombies. Quite frankly, I don't want to do that. And there are many reasons why I believe that would not be the case. In fact, let me just make this simple observation to you. I would argue to you, and I think this holds especially true of Iowa, that the vast majority of Americans get nothing out of the drug laws for the simple reason that the vast majority of Americans don't need drug laws to keep from becoming drug abusers or drug addicts. That's the bottom line. In fact, if you really ask the question and really play it out, you realize that most of us are to one degree or another victims of drug prohibition. We don't need it to keep from becoming drug abusers or drug addicts, and our children don't need it, because generally we know better. For the same reasons we don't get behind the wheel of a car and drive and kill people, and most of us don't smoke cigarettes. Well, I don't see why most of us are going to go out and use crack or stick needles into our arms. Right? That's an important point to realize. And for those people who are not deterred by the drug laws, and who do go and use drugs, most of them are worse off, because they can lose their job, go to jail, because the drugs they get, they have to get from criminals, and because the drugs they get are polluted and dirty, and they may overdose and die. So who benefits from drug prohibition, right? Besides all the law enforcement establishment and the drug traffickers making fortunes. Who benefits? One group. It's those people who need drug laws to keep from becoming drug abusers or drug addicts. And the real question, I'm not sure, I've never debated Bob before, so I'm not sure where he is on this issue. But when it becomes a high-level objective debate, what you really get is a disagreement over what is that vulnerable population in America. I have some faith that it's not so great, that it's not so much greater, if it even is greater, than the current size of drug abusers in this country. Others are much more pessimistic. And that's why thoughtful, honest people disagree with me. But it's because they look at it and they say, no, we're more vulnerable than you think. And that's something that we don't really have an answer to, which is why we should not jump suddenly into legalization, why we should go step by step. Now, let me go through this analysis quite quickly. And I want to try to explain how I think we should look at drug policy and ask to what extent it works, to ask to what extent prohibition actually works. First, drug enforcement. Think of 5 different components of drug enforcement. First, international, right, trying to keep the drugs from being exported to the United States. Secondly, interdiction, which is the airs and the seas around our borders. Third, domestic enforcement going after the big drug traffickers. Fourth, domestic enforcement going after the little street guys. And fifth, drug testing. And let's ask, what do these do? How much can they work? Why don't they work that well? First, the international side of things. You heard it in the 88 campaign, you continue to hear it. This notion that if we were really serious, we could keep drugs from coming into the United States. We could bomb Colombia, we could coerce Bolivia, we could do this to Burma and Thailand, and that to Peru and Jamaica or what have you. Somehow we can keep it. I don't know if people still believe this anymore. I mean, so much evidence has come out proving that that is an absurd, fallacious assumption that it may not be worth going into. But let's just look very briefly. Why is it so hard to keep these drugs from coming in? One is simply the fact that we are not, people say we're the biggest consumer of drugs in the world. That's not true. That's not true. I mean, there are levels of opiate use, of opium and heroin and what have you in parts of Asia that are much greater than are in the United States. And cannabis use, much greater than is here. And coca use, much greater than is here. Only crack, we've gotten lucky with crack. In part, I think, because of our prohibition system, and I'll explain that. Right? But most of these drugs are grown all over the world in large parts. Opium can be grown almost anywhere in the world, which then produces heroin. Cannabis, almost any place in the world. And even coca, which is used to produce cocaine, only 1/100th of the coca growable land in Latin America is now being used to grow coca. Right? And it can grow in all other parts of the world. It has grown in East Asia, and it's grown in Puerto Rico and all sorts of other places as well. And mind you, you can always have synthetic drugs as well, have with much the same effect. And there's another factor. It's called the push-down pop-up factor. What's the push-down pop-up factor? Very simple. It's when Nixon pushed down on heroin coming out of Turkey in the early 1970s. It popped up in Mexico. And then we pushed down on Mexico, and it popped up in Southeast Asia. We pushed down there, and it popped up in Southwest Asia. We've now pushed down so many places, it popped up everywhere. The United States is now a multi-source heroin importing country. Right? Marijuana, the same thing. We pushed down on Mexico, it popped up in Colombia. We pushed down there, it popped up in Jamaica. We pushed down there, it popped up in Colombia again, and Mexico again, and in Thailand and what have you, and in the United States, of course. Right? We haven't yet pushed down on coca in Bolivia and Peru, but rest assured, when we do push down, it will pop up elsewhere, in other countries, in Ecuador, in Brazil, and what have you, and in other parts of the countries that are now growing it. Right? And let's remember, the peasants aren't stupid. Right? They're not stupid. I mean, you push down, you wipe out their little crop, or their big crop, and what do? They grow a smaller crop. They get off the main roads and they go into the hinterlands and the valleys and the mountains. They camouflage their crops with legitimate products. They respond. They engage in what are called guerrilla farming methods. They respond. Right? And let's remember also that this makes a lot of money in these countries. There's a reason why the corruption is so powerful. It's because they're not earning. Corruption's a problem here, and drug-related corruption's a problem here. But down there, it's a lot of money, billions of dollars. Never mind the tens of billions going into Miami real estate and Panama and Swiss banks. Still billions going into those countries. And there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of peasants, of poor peasants, campesinos, basically decent people, earning a very good living from this. Very good living. Not a fantastic living, but a good living. Better than they've earned from other crops, better than their parents have earned, better than their grandparents have earned, and so on. And the thought that we're going to come and take this from them and suppress it, it doesn't go down very well. In fact, there's a sort of paradox here. It's interesting. Some people have said, not entirely in jest, that the U.S. international drug policy, with its aiming to try to suppress and illegalize but unable to do so, and thereby enriching all these peasants, is probably the best means ever devised for exporting the capitalist ethic to potentially revolutionary third world peasants. Right? I mean, they're buying refrigerators, they're hooked into the international economy. It's had a positive benefit in that respect. And you know what happens when the American officials go down there and they meet with these peasants, and I've heard this from people in William Bennett's office, the drug czar's office, and they say, don't you realize what you're doing? How immoral what you're doing is? Selling these drugs that are poisoning the children in America. And the peasants look at them and they say, don't you talk to me about morality. Let me tell you what my moral obligations are. My moral obligations, they're not to keep some stupid gringo from shoving some white powder up his nose or sticking a needle into his arm. No. My moral obligation is to do the best I can for myself, my family, and my community. And if that means producing this drug, this coca, cannabis, opium, or what have you, which many times, moreover, goes back where I live hundreds, if not thousands of years, and has been adapted in our cultures, and we've never had any problem with it. We don't understand what your problem is. If that's what I need to do, then so be it. That's what I will do. That's what I will do. And meanwhile, you North Americanos, you hypocrites, with your special trade representatives flying around the world to less developed countries and pushing down trade barriers so that you can export more of your lethal tobacco products around the world. You speak to me of moralities? Don't make me laugh. Well, that suggests that all these international control efforts aren't worth a damn. Giving economic aid to these countries may be a nice thing. It might be good for political reasons to oppose the leftist insurgencies that are growing there. It may be good for humanitarian reasons, but don't believe it's really going to have an effect on drug policy. That it's going to somehow we can give enough aid that all the peasants will flock out of growing coca and start growing things like oranges or the latest craze, macadamia nuts. Right? There's a very large international market for macadamia nuts, I guess. Or silkworms, that's another interesting one, right? I mean, it's cute, right? But you really think about 1 million peasants are going to switch out of other things for this? And who's going to provide the transportation? Which brings us to interdiction. The airs, the seas, trying to keep the drugs out. Can that work? No, of course it can't. It's ludicrous. Why? Because trying to find the 5 or 10 tons of heroin, the 100 or 200 tons of cocaine coming to the United States each year makes looking for a needle in a haystack seem like child's play in comparison. Right? I mean, you think about this network we've set up. We have radar balloons, AWACS, Air Force planes, Navy, Coast Guard, Customs flying around. We have this radar system in northern Canada that was set up to look for Soviet missiles coming over the North Pole. We're not so worried about that now, so we turned it around to look for drug planes coming from South America, because as you all know, all the drug planes coming from South America carry a special lettering and signal on them which says drug smuggling plane on it. So of course they're easy to recognize. Right? I mean, think about how do these drugs come in? They come in every which way. They come in large planes and small planes. They come in big boats and small boats and yachts. They go in container shipping to Europe and back to the United States or up to Canada and down through the northern border. They go over the Mexican border. They go on the backs of legal immigrants and illegal immigrants. They go in trucks, they go in cars, and they go in buses. They get thrown over the border. They get put into cars and furniture and flowers and you name it. One way or another, these drugs are coming in. If there were a market in the United States for 100 tons of heroin a year, instead of 5 or 10 tons of heroin a year, it would come in. It would come in. This is not a supply-driven market. This is a demand-driven market. It would come in. So these efforts don't work. They cost a lot of money, billions of dollars, but they don't work. They don't make a difference. Wait, I should correct myself. They have made some difference. They have made some difference. And you know, with respect to what? With respect to marijuana. I heard this fact, 2 principal consequences from this marijuana interdiction success, because there is a lot less foreign marijuana coming to the United States in the 1980s. I heard this from the head of the Coast Guard drug interdiction program a few years ago. And he said, you know, we found, as we've been increasingly successful at interdicting marijuana, the drug dealers seem to be switching to cocaine. What did he expect? I mean, marijuana is bulky, smelly, not that profitable. Cocaine, nice, compact, lucrative, right? Of course they switch. Just like during Prohibition, people didn't want to deal in beer anymore. They dealt in the hardest liquor they could find, more compact. Who's going to fill up a trunk with beer when you could put nice 180 proof booze in the back? And in Asia, with the opium monopolies that they had for decades, if not hundreds of years. As soon as they banned those things a few decades ago, under pressure from the US and the UN, what happened? Well, they did reduce opium smoking among the elderly, right? And almost instantly, dramatic increases in heroin addiction among the young. Why? Heroin 1/10 the bulk of opium and much more discreet to consume and more profitable in the final analysis. You can look at the evidence. There is direct relationships between the success in interdicting marijuana in the early 80s and the emergence of crack in many inner cities in this country. Direct relationships. Many people in the inner cities believe there's a conspiracy that must be involved. They believe in many conspiracies, but one of them is to keep the marijuana out and let the crack in, because crack is so much of a harder drug to control. Right? And what's the second consequence of our marijuana interdiction success? You know who has emerged as perhaps the #1 producer of marijuana in the world? Good old US of A. Right? I understand there's a drought now, but nonetheless, we're still #1. Right? It's now the #1, 2, or 3 cash crop in Hawaii, in Oregon, Kentucky, Missouri, Vermont, I don't know, Iowa. Right? Many people say the United States now produces the finest marijuana in the world. Some people think if the dollar drops any lower, the United States will become a major exporter of marijuana. Is that such a successful drug policy? Well, that's interdiction. What about domestic enforcement then? Assuming the drugs are coming in, which they have been and will continue to do so so long as there is demand. What about domestic enforcement? Going after the big drug traffickers. Yes, fine, that's good. That's where our resources should be devoted. So long as we have the drug laws and they need to be enforced, it seems to me the people we should target are those people who are most profitably and violently and egregiously violating the laws. So go get them, that's fine. But ask yourself, does it really make any difference? Does it make any difference to the bottom line availability of drugs on the streets? Does it make any difference to the problem of cocaine babies, the problem of drug-related AIDS, of the overdoses? Well, the answer is no. And why not? Very simply, because every time the cops arrest Mr. #1, Mr. #2 is waiting to step into his shoes. And every time they get #2, Mr. #3 is waiting to step into his shoes. And where do the police usually get the information to get #1? It's from #2 because he wants to be #1. Right? You know this. Right? I personally think that Colombia should extradite those miserable human beings who are exporting cocaine to the United States, and I've told them so. I think it would have very positive symbolic purposes. But would it make any difference to the flow of drugs? In the United States, no, of course not. Why? The same reason. You get numeral doses there. You get numeral tresses there. Right? They'll just be replaced and replaced. It won't make any difference. Unless, of course, you believe in the theory of a cocaine cartel controlling the amount of cocaine coming to the United States in order to raise prices. In which case, you cut off the heads of the cartel, there'll be less control, and more cocaine coming to the United States. So that doesn't seem like the answer. Well, finally, we have street level enforcement. Street level enforcement. Some people have found that street level enforcement can make a difference. And it may make a difference in Iowa. It may make a difference in small towns. In small towns where you can get the drug dealers off the streets, especially of the hard drugs, and the kids can't drive far enough to get to the next drug dealer. Maybe it makes a difference. But does it make any difference? All these intensive street sweeps and pressure points and what have you, right? In the cities. I mean, look at New Jersey, Camden, Newark. I don't know, I mean, tell me about Des Moines or the other cities here. I don't really know the story. But I know that in all the cities I'm familiar with, any even moderately sized city, it doesn't eliminate drugs. It doesn't keep drugs out of the hands of those people who want them. It does clean up certain neighborhoods, but it inevitably messes up other neighborhoods, all these intensive street sweeps. Why? The same thing that happens internationally, the good old push-down pop-up. You know, in New York City, you push down on Washington Square, it pops up in the Alphabet Streets. You push down on 100th and 5th Avenue, it pops up on 105th and 5th Avenue. In Washington, you push down on 14th and I, and it pops up on 14th and I, that's DEA headquarters. Push down on 14th and K, it pops up on 18th and H or something like that, right? And where do the police usually push down? It's usually in those neighborhoods where the residents have enough political oomph to get the mayor on the phone and say, Mayor, I want my neighborhood cleaned up, mess up somebody else's, right? And meanwhile, it costs a lot. It gets very costly. So it's not the answer. So finally, drug testing. Drug testing may well be the wave of the future, may well be the wave of the future. It's gone a long way in the last 5 or 6 years. And I know, if I were to tell my Princeton students that unless they took a periodic drug test for illegal drugs, that if they failed, they wouldn't graduate. And I think if we did a test like that, it might reduce the very small number of Princeton students using drugs to an even smaller number. A few might get caught, kicked out, wreck their lives, but it's a cost, right? In fact, I'll propose to you a perfect alternative solution to the drug problem. It has nothing to do with legalization. And it will probably be possible in 10 years, technologically possible. And it's this. We set up a nationally computerized system with everybody's name, social security number, thumbprint, eye print, blood type, all your other unique characteristics in this computer. And everybody has an outlet in their home or their dorm room or their prison cell. And every morning, by law, you have to walk up to that machine and put your thumb up to it or piece of hair or pee into it for a drug test. And if you fail, you get a shot. If you fail a second time, get a bigger shot. And a third time, an even bigger shot. And so on up until you get the message. Right? I actually think that would go a long ways towards eliminating the problem of illicit drug abuse in the United States. But do I think we should do it? Well, the answer is no. I'm a little worried because I'm worried some people out there actually think we should do it. But I don't think we should. And why not? Well, it's very simple. It boils down not just to public policy, but to values. Because I am concerned about things like privacy. I am concerned about things like individual freedom. I do worry about Big Brother and his intrusion into every home and every bedroom and dorm room and what have you. I do worry about those things. Those are values. And there's the question, of course, of the slippery slope. You know what the slippery slope is? Where do you stop? If you can justify it for cocaine and heroin and then for marijuana. Well, you can also justify it, of course, for alcohol and tobacco. Because everybody knows that alcohol and tobacco also, well, alcohol causes work-related accidents, and tobacco and alcohol cause health-related costs to employers and what have you, and reduce job productivity. And then what next? What next? Fried foods. Testing for fried foods every morning. Why not? I mean, hell, look at the Japanese. The Japanese, they smoke like fish, but they live longer than us. Why? They don't eat fried food, right? Right? And where do you stop? In fact, if you think about it, if your principal objective of government policy is nothing but to extend the lives of Americans for as long as possible, and as long as that's the objective, then why bother with any form of privacy? I mean, I saw these reports a few months ago that showed that it might be possible for ordinary human beings to double their lifespan if they survive on something like 1,200 calories of broccoli and celery and some other sorts of things, right? I mean, we could enforce that. And my God, us Americans would live longer than anybody else in the world. But should we do it? Why? We have no constitutional right, to eat what we want to eat. You can ban steak and you can ban carrots. You can ban whatever you want. There is no constitutional right. Maybe there should be, but there's not. But where do you stop? When you start heading down that way, where do you stop? Where do you stop? Okay. So what have I said? That law enforcement doesn't work? No, I haven't said that. Law enforcement does work to some extent. It does work to some extent. We do know that law enforcement does increase the price of drugs higher than they otherwise would be, quite substantially. We know it decreases the availability, maybe not in the inner cities, but in other parts of the country. And we know the criminal sanction does deter some people. So I'm not saying it doesn't work. It does work to some extent, and it has worked to some extent. So why not continue with it? Well, that comes to the second part of the argument. It's because so much of what people identify as part and parcel of the drug problem are, in fact, the results of drug prohibition. Now, let me explain this. Let's first look at the direct costs. And I'm sorry I didn't bring the figures for Iowa with me here. But I know them for other states, and I know them for the federal government at large. I'd estimate we spent something like $20 billion in 1990 just enforcing drug laws against possession, sale, manufacture. Never mind all this drug-related crime, never mind all these broader costs, all this sort of stuff, just enforcing drug laws. Police, courts, prisons, prosecutors. About $20 billion, which is about 4 or 5 times what it was just 10 years ago. In the federal prisons today, 40% of all the people in federal prisons are there for violating drug laws. 40%. Interesting study shows that 40% has the least rate of prior convictions of all the prisoners in federal prison, and secondly, has the least record of violent behavior. I'm not saying they're model human beings, but nonetheless, it's interesting. In New York State, not just in New York City, I'm talking about New York State, which includes rural areas and what have you, 40% of all the people admitted into state prisons last year were for violating drug laws. In Florida, it was just about 40%. In California, about 40%. In Washington, D.C., over 50%. And in every single of the 10 or 20 most populated states in this country, at least 20% of all the admissions into state prison last year were for violating drug laws. Costs a lot of money. Costs a lot of money. It's also a lot of people. In 1990, the United States passed 1 million people. 1 million people out of a population of about 250 million. 1 million people behind bars, plus another 3 million under other forms of criminal justice supervision. That 1 million in federal, state, and local prisons and jails is double what it was in 1980, almost triple what it was in 1975. It is the highest proportion of the American population to be incarcerated in American history. It is the highest proportion of any democratic society to be incarcerated in world history. Ask yourself a question. Why? Why? What has it accomplished? What has it accomplished? Another interesting study the Rand Corporation did in Washington, D.C. They looked at all the people being thrown in jail in Washington, D.C. for drug law violations, for drug dealing. And you know what they found? 50% of them had full-time legal jobs. They did the drug dealing on the side. Right? Once again, I'm not saying they're model citizens, but it's interesting. These people were actually paying taxes and maybe supporting families. 50%. Instead, we shove them to prison. And what's prison? Well, first of all, it costs you between $15,000 and $50,000 a year to maintain. Right? Secondly, we take away providers for families who then go on welfare systems and social service systems and what have you. Thirdly, they're training schools for prisons. The cops are trying to figure out how the hell did these Nigerian drug traffickers make contact with the Hispanic community in San Antonio? Well, it's almost always in prison. That's where you learn how to be a criminal. It's where you make the connections. It's where you form the bonds and what have you. In some cities, the drug dealing outside the prisons is run from within the prisons. Right? It's not like the good old days. You commit a crime in England, you ship them off to Australia, all it costs you is boat fare. Right? This is costing millions, billions of dollars each year. There's probably at least 200,000, if not close to 300,000 people in prisons right today just for violating the drug laws, for essentially engaging in a vice crime. Let's face it, that is what it is. It's a vice crime. Notice there are usually no victims to go and complain to the authorities about this. Quite frankly, I am not soft on crime. And most of these quote-unquote legalizers are not that soft on crime, right? But it seems to me there's two types of crimes and two types of criminals. There's the types of crimes and criminals that you can walk away from, right? The prostitutes and the gamblers and the drug dealers. And there's the types of criminals you cannot walk away from. right? The robbers and the muggers and the rapists and the murderers and the extortionists and the savings and loan crooks, right? And it seems to me, where should our law enforcement resources be going? It should be going to deal with those types of criminals you cannot walk away from, and we should be a hell of a lot harder on them. I hate to see the head of the FBI go before Congress and ask, what do you do about savings and loan? He says, well, you know, quite frankly, we're too busy. What are you busy with, Mr. Head of the FBI? We're busy going after drugs. You know, the SNL crisis has done and will do more harm to this country than the drug crisis ever has. And those $500 billion that are going down the drain could save a lot of lives if they weren't going for the type of crap we have to bail out.